Hey, what's up guys? So in this video, we're going to be testing 13 different radar detectors against K-band instant-on radar. Now for this test, I'm going to be using a Kustom Falcon HR handheld K-band police radar gun. And the objective of the test is to see how long it takes different radar detectors to start alerting once an officer starts targeting you with his radar gun. And because timing is so critical in this test, before every single test run, I would do a series of claps to allow me to perfectly sync both cameras. Then Yellow Eye would drive off with a different radar detector in his Miata, and he would drive back and forth, and I would target him, first shooting him from behind with the radar gun, and then he would turn around and I would shoot him again from the front. And again, the whole point is to see how fast different radar detectors will start alerting once I'm actually shooting him with the radar gun. Additionally, because there's so many false alerts on K-band, I also experimented with different filtering options, usually TSF and TSR, which can be helpful for some additional BSM filtering to see the impact that the filters can have. And so on K-band, I actually did a lot of testing, a lot more than I did on Ka-band. Additionally, I did multiple rounds of testing. The first round of testing, I tested all the detectors, but for some of them, I was running an Escort power cable with a non-Escort detector, which, as I mentioned in the Ka-band video, could potentially cause some issues. So for that reason, I did a second round of testing, going back out with the detectors and running the manufacturer's cables as necessary to see, are the results the same? Can I verify the results, or did the cables actually cause problems? Retesting on Ka-band, I found that using the manufacturer's cable did not improve the results, and we'll see if the same is true here on K-band as well. And then finally, after that, in case there were still some uncertainties or some questions that I had, I went back out and tested yet again for a third time just to really go in and find out some of the details for sure. Now, with all the testing that I did, I'm sure you guys don't want to sit and watch an hour-long video with all the test results, and honestly, I don't want to spend the next week or two editing an hour-long video or so. And so in this video, I'm just going to summarize the results. But I'll tell you right up front, there were some really big surprises that I saw here, especially on K-band, as well as some really critical issues that I discovered with a couple detectors that I definitely want to talk about as well. And so in this video, we're basically going to run through all the things that I learned, both in terms of different radar detectors and settings, as well as the radar gun that I was testing with. So starting off, let's begin with the Uniden R7. So just like with Ka-band, on K-band, the R7 is hilariously, ridiculously fast. The alert times were consistently right around 1/3 of a second or so. And this was true both with TSF off or even TSF on. Additionally, I found this to be true both with the Escort power cable and the Uniden power cable, so it looks like the brand of power cable didn't make a difference, at least in this particular test. Now, as for the arrow accuracy, the arrows were not on point. However, since then, firmware 1.37 has come out, which should improve the arrows here with the R7, but the testing that I did was back with firmware 1.35. I haven't yet tested firmware 1.37 on K-band to see the difference that it makes. Next, moving on to the Uniden R3, the results that I saw here were pretty much the same as what I saw with the R7. The alert times were right around 1/3 of a second or so, maybe a hair slower or so. Now, to be fair, there is a little bit of fudge factor in my timing, about 3 to 600ths of a second or so, depending on kind of when I measured the claps, but the results should be pretty close here. Either way, the R3 was still very fast, and I would actually say that the Uniden R series, it gets a gold star when it comes to K-band responsiveness. Next, moving on to the Uniden DFR8, one of Uniden's more budget platform detectors. With this detector, results are going to be a hair slower. Your alert times are going to be around half a second or so with TSF turned off. Then, if you turn TSF back on to get better false alert filtering, your alert times are actually going to be over a second, so that's definitely going to slow things down. So unlike the R series, TSF does have a measurable impact in terms of K-band response times. I also found this to be true both for the Escort power cables as well as the Uniden power cables. Next, let's take a look at the Batman detector. It's a cheap, low-end detector that you can find online for 20 to 30 bucks. Now, don't expect good filtering here or anything. The thing falses constantly, but it's kind of fun to throw into the mix. Testing with this detector, your response times were around half a second or so. And this was true both testing in the front or testing in the rear. Again, there's zero BSM filtering going on here, so the results are not really going to be useful, but it's good to at least kind of get a sense of what we can expect there. Next, taking a look at the Radenso Pro M, the results here were actually kind of similar to what I saw with the Uniden DFR8. The Pro M would take about 0.5 to 0.6 seconds or so to alert, and this was true when the traffic sensor rejection filter was set to low or even disabled altogether. Then when I set the traffic sensor rejection filter to high to get more BSM filtering, response times jumped to over a second, so I actually did see a performance difference when switching between TS-Reg low or high. Next, taking a look at the Radenso XP, I noticed the results here were a little bit variable when testing with TSR off. Testing with the Escort cable, for example, the alert times were around 0.6 to 0.8 seconds. And then testing with the Radenso cable, it took about 0.9 seconds to a full second or so. Then testing with TSR turned on, this slows the detector down to about 1.5 seconds or so, regardless of the cable that I ran. Now, I also saw a little bit of variance in the results when retesting on Ka-band too, just like I did with K-band. I don't know if this is a cable thing or if it's just run-to-run variation. It would be nice to go back and do a bunch more runs to figure this out for sure. But if we look at just the results from running with the Radenso cable, I find the detector takes about 1 second to go off with TSR turned off, or about 1.5 seconds to go off if you have TSR turned on. So the results here are definitely starting to get slower than the competition. Now, regardless of the cables that I tested with, I found some issues with the ramp up. The detector would typically alert to a signal strength of only about 3 to 5 out of 9 or so, and then it ramped up quickly. This sort of behavior was pretty constant. I never saw the detector alert full tilt as I was getting shot with instant-on, either from the front or from the rear. So just like with Ka-band, the ramp up and signal presentation isn't really accurate and reflective of what you're experiencing in real life. Next, let's take a look at the Rocky Mountain Radar Judge 2.0. Now, this is a detector where things start to get pretty bad. Now, with the Judge, I of course turned on the scrambling capability, which is supposed to prevent the radar gun from being able to get a speed. It's a Rocky Mountain radar detector, so of course let's turn that on and see how well it works. So starting off and testing from the front, it took about 1 second for the detector to begin alerting with TSR turned off. And the radar gun itself had no problem to immediately lock in the speed and continue holding it the entire time. Then turning around and testing from the rear, again, there was no scrambling happening on the radar gun. The radar gun worked completely fine. But the bigger issue was the fact that it took nearly 8 seconds for the detector to go off and let you know that the officer has actually been locking in your speed this entire time. Now, if you think that's bad, watch what happens when we turn TSR on to get a little bit better false alert filtering. Now, starting with the front detection, instead of a 1 second delay, it now jumps to 2.6 seconds, so even longer of a delay. Then testing from the rear, I actually got no alert at all with TSR turned on. There's no scrambling happening, of course, on the radar gun, but really the bigger issue is the fact that the radar detector never alerted whatsoever to the radar gun. Now, we usually give Rocky Mountain radar products, a hard time about their scrambling capabilities and the lies about all that, but I know a lot of times people wonder, well, how is the detector as a radar detector? How does it perform? Well, here you go. Next, let's take a look at a better radar detector, the Whistler CR97. This detector did great on Ka-band, and let's take a look at now how it fares on K-band. Now, I'll be up front and just let you know that I'm not super familiar with all the nuances of the different filtering options on the Whistlers. Performance tends to be not that great, and so in terms of long range and stuff, so I tend to not run the detectors too much, and so I just kind of went by other people's recommendations on the forums. Now that said, I found the response times of the CR97 to be surprisingly good. The detector would only take about 0.4 to 0.6 seconds to go off. Now, that's actually really good, especially considering the fact that I was running it with the X and K-band filter, but at 3. The default setting is only 1. It's possible that if I kind of back down this filter, it might have sped up the detector even more. I didn't actually test that, but it's a thought. Now that said, Whistler also has a TFSR option, or the traffic filter sensor rejection. Similar option to what I've been testing with the other detectors, and turning this option on, this actually seemed to really slow down the detector. Now testing with front detections, it slowed it down from about half a second to about 0.8 seconds, and that's admittedly not that bad, but I also noticed that when we tested from the rear, it now took just under 2 seconds to go off, so definitely starting to slow down here with this option enabled. And so for that reason, if you're running something like a CR97 and you're concerned about K-band instant on, it looks like disabling TFSR would be the way to go. Next, let's take a look at the Valentine 1 Gen 2. Now, this is the detector that I spent the most amount of time testing, especially because of the fact that Valentine on their website says if you use an Escort smart cord with their detector, it's going to cause a number of issues with the detector. And when I was testing with the Escort cable on the V1, I found the alert times were all around 1 second or so. That said, I did see the alerts go as slow as 1.4 seconds. Then when I retested with the Valentine cable, I actually again found the detector generally took about 1 second to go off. Now, this 1 second alert time, it applied to the detector running in advanced logic mode, which has the most aggressive filtering. It also applied to just regular logic mode too. Surprisingly then, when I tested it in all bogeys mode, the alert times dropped to just 0.7 seconds. Now, this is actually really weird and doesn't make sense. Now, all bogeys mode and logic mode should actually perform identically. The only difference there is the fact that logic mode is just going to mute any weak signals, and then as you get closer and they get stronger, then it's going to begin audibly alerting normally. But performance and all the initial alert stuff is still going to be otherwise identical. I also went and double-checked the manual itself just to double-check this. Now, it mentions that in logic and advanced logic modes, the analyzer is doing some additional analysis. However, there is an exception for strong instant-on radar shots like this. It says that the analyzer in the V1 has years of radar experience. It knows that instant-on radar is a greater threat than ordinary radar. Therefore, it will always warn of instant-on immediately at the initial volume whenever it's detected. And so if it's picking up instant radar, it's going to start punching through the filters and definitely make sure that you get notified. Now that said, I was kind of confused by the results that all bogeys mode was actually performing faster. Is that run-to-run variation? Was it a fluke, or is this actually perform better? For that reason, I went back out to go test a third time. And the V1 doesn't have GPS in it, so it should be just fine testing stationary, and that conveniently makes it easier for me to go and test solo. I was actually using a flashlight to sync the two different cameras from a distance. But either way, I then did 5 more test shots in all bogeys mode, and while there was a little bit of run-to-run variation here, I found that all 5 shots took 0.9 to 1 second to go off, which again is right on par with what I saw with the other logic modes. So it looks like 1 second is basically the alert times that I've been seeing here with the Falcon HR. Now, I'd mentioned in the previous KA video that there were times when I saw the detector actually alert to multiple bogeys, multiple signals on KA. I know we were concerned that what if that was happening because of the power cable. When I went back and retested it on KA band, I found that even with the Valentine branded power cable, there were still certain situations to where it would display 2 bogeys. It would then drop to 1, but it could still actually display multiple bogeys. Other times it was still just fine alerting to 1, but that was still possible even with the Valentine cable. But coming back to K-band here real quick, if we were to just summarize kind of what we found here, with strong K-band instant-on radar against the Falcon HR, it takes the V1 Gen 2 1 second to go off. Maybe plus minus a little bit due to run-to-run variation, but it seems like overall what I'm seeing here with the V1 Gen 2 is going to be right around 1 second alert times. Next, let's move on and start taking a look at some Escort detectors. We'll start first with the Escort Max 3. Now with this detector, I found the results could be kind of variable. I mean, it would do anything from alert times under a second to closer to 2.5 seconds. For example, on highway mode with TSR off, the detector would take over a second to alert to K-band instant on. Then if I turned on TSR, which typically slows down K-band performance, it took 2.5 seconds to go off to front radar, but it was actually way faster to go off from the rear at only 0.8 seconds. This was really strange. It gave both the slowest and the fastest results of all of the Max 3 testing. Then testing in auto mode, which reduces the detector's sensitivity and adds more filtering at lower speeds. It took 2 seconds to go off when picking up radar from the front, and then when testing picking up radar from behind, it took 1 second to go off in this situation. And none of the options that I played with made the detector really quick, and honestly the results were kind of all over the place here with the Max 3. I'm not really sure what was up with that. I was hoping to see something kind of more predictable, like turn on TSR and it gets slower, and turn it off and it gets faster. But that's not really what I saw here with this detector. Maybe even more runs would help me get a better sense of the big picture or something, but either way, the alert times are around 1 to 2.5 seconds, which is definitely starting to get slow here. Next, we can take a look at the Escort Redline 360C, and this detector was also pretty slow. Starting off with some of the filters disabled, like running in highway mode and with TSR turned off, the alert times were just under 1.5 seconds or so, both front and rear. Then testing with TSR on, the results would be anywhere from 1.5 seconds to actually 2.7 seconds, so definitely starting to slow down even more. Then switching over to auto mode with TSR still on, again, the detector took 1.5 seconds to go off, and this was true both from the front and from the rear. So 1.5 seconds, I guess, is kind of the number that I've been seeing here from the Redline 360C. And so the Redline 360C honestly had a pretty poor showing. I mean, it was turning in kind of lower end results here. Now, I know over on Escort's website, they make a big deal about their new software-defined radio architecture, as well as their processor that's 25 times faster, which provides rapid response times and alerts faster than ever before. I'm not sure what all that's in reference to, but I'm definitely not seeing it reflected here in this specific test. And this is true both for K and KA. Definitely things are looking slower here. And speaking of KA, remember the kind of Wi-Fi issue that I ran into last time testing on KA? I did 4 more test passes on KA band, and all of the results here were anywhere between 0.8 to 1 second or so, which again is slower than a lot of the other detectors. So considering the price point of the Redline 360C, as well as what Escort has been telling us about the detector, I'm definitely expecting more here out of this detector. I've already reported this information over to Escort. I know they're looking at it, so hopefully we'll see an improvement here in a future update. But right now, it's kind of turning in bottom of the barrel results, and the Redline 360C, it just shouldn't be doing that. Next, let's move on and take a look at the Max 360C. Now, this detector is actually more responsive than the Redline 360C is. With the Max 360C, it would typically take around 0.6 seconds to alert, so faster than the Redline. Testing with TSR on did sometimes slow the detector down, but still only to 1 second max. Then testing with auto mode and TSR on, the detector would take 0.6 to 0.7 seconds or so to go off. And so the Max 360C, it's definitely faster and more responsive than the Redline 360C is. It's also faster than the V1 Gen 2 is. In fact, it's only the Uniden R series, the R7 and the R3, that were able to kind of alert to radar faster when still having all of the filters enabled. The DFR8 Pro M and CR97 were also able to be faster, but only if you started disabling some of the filters. When all the filters were maxed out, it was only the R series that was able to outperform the Max 360C. And then finally, let's take a look at the Cobra Road Scout. This is a radar detector and dash cam combo. This is also the worst performing radar detector out of all of the detectors that I tested. When I tested on Ka band, it took anywhere from 2 to 6 seconds to go off. And when I tested on K band, I actually saw similar results here, or worse. Now, testing with front detections in highway mode, it took the detector 3 seconds to go off to radar, both with TSR on or TSR turned off. Now, what's worse than that is then when I tested from the rear, I got no alert out of the Road Scout at all. Nothing. The radar gun was able to get the vehicle speed the entire time, and the Road Scout was dead silent. Then when I switched the detector to auto mode, which adds some additional filtering, the alert time slowed down from the front. Instead of taking 3 seconds to go off, it now takes 5 seconds. So slowing down even more here. And then testing from the rear, just like in highway mode with TSR on or TSR off, we again got no alert at all with the Road Scout. 3 separate rear shots and not a single alert out of the detector. The only other detector to sometimes not alert to rear shots was the Rocky Mountain Radar Judge 2.0. Now, I know we can kind of split hairs and kind of argue the difference of like 0.3 seconds versus 0.5 seconds or even 1 full second. But when you start getting to 3 seconds or 5 seconds of a delay or no alert at all, I mean, come on. I don't know how you can justify that kind of behavior. If an officer is able to target you, I mean, at close range and easily lock in your speed and your detector just decides to never go off at all, as far as I'm concerned, that behavior is completely unacceptable. Even the $20 Batman detector would at least alert you. No filtering, the detector's awful, but still, I mean, come on. The Cobra Road Scout, that's a $450 detector. Looking online though now, I'm seeing it available for $399, so $50 off, but still not cheap. Yeah, I published a full review of that detector recently on my website. I'll link to it in the video description. Cool idea, but some really, really serious and critical performance issues with that detector, so Cobra Road Scout, no. Anyways, moving on, let's take a look at the radar gun that I tested with next, this Kustom Falcon HR. Now, in testing, the gun was pretty quick at actually locking in speeds. It would typically take about 1/3 of a second or so. Maybe up to half a second, but typically around 1/3 of a second. I did notice it would sometimes occasionally struggle to lock in a vehicle's speed if they're a little bit farther away, but it only did this twice in the whole test. One of those shots, the gun actually really struggled to get a speed. This was when I was doing some private testing of an international radar detector, so I'm not going to be releasing the results with that detector, but with the radar gun, I found there are some situations to where it can actually struggle to acquire a speed. Overall, though, it only happened twice out of all the test passes we did, and overall, yeah, the gun actually did a really nice job of locking in a speed typically around 1/3 of a second or so. When I tested on Ka band with the stocker DSR2X, that gun was rock solid and consistent, reliable. I didn't have any issues here with that particular gun. Now, with the Falcon HR, I ran it in directional mode. You can set the gun to where instead of bidirectional mode, clocking in both directions, or well, all directions, you can set it up to only monitor vehicles that are approaching, coming towards you, or maybe only vehicles that are receding and moving away. And this can definitely be useful to filter out traffic that's driving in the opposite direction, again, just to display the speed of the radar detector car and not the other traffic on the road too. Now that said, I had the gun set up to only track the strongest target. I wasn't using the fastest mode capability. I honestly didn't know the gun had a fastest mode option until right before I shot this video. I sat back down with the manual and looked it up. Turns out there is a way to use fastest mode, but it's kind of weird here on the Falcon HR. Normally with this gun, when you want to start transmitting, you just pull the button like this and start firing. And so you just pull the trigger and it starts transmitting and displaying different vehicle speeds. Now the trick here is if you double press the transmit button, you'll see it now displays fast on screen. And this is going to allow it to display both the strongest and the fastest target speeds. And I wish I was actually doing this in testing. You see, sometimes there was an issue locking in the speed of the radar detector car if there was a bigger vehicle, maybe farther away than the Miata. The gun would actually switch back and forth between both vehicles and make it more confusing for me with the radar gun. Now, to be fair, this wasn't an issue in this specific test, since really all I was caring about was the reaction time of the detector relative to the gun, but it was still annoying regardless. Anyway, coming back now to the radar detectors, let's run through kind of a summary of everything that we learned here in this test. Now, starting off, when it comes to comparing K and KA, with a lot of detectors, the performance numbers were actually pretty similar, but with some other detectors, they were actually more responsive on KA band than on K band, which kind of makes sense. Usually you've got additional filtering and stuff on K band to deal with your false alerts and your BSMs and your door openers and all that kind of stuff, versus KA band, usually the detectors are going to be more responsive, and I found that to be true with a number of detectors. Now, as far as the Uniden R series detectors, these are a beast. On both K and KA, these detectors are fantastic. They're super responsive and great at letting you know as soon as something is going on around you. Now, that said, when it comes to weak instant on, it looks like there may actually be some issues with the detector. We just started seeing this on the forums kind of as I was getting ready to shoot this video, and a number of people have actually started reporting issues when it comes to weak instant on radar signals. Now, for this specific test, I've been focusing on strong instant on radar, right? Close range. There's, of course, a million different tests that we can do in different ways to kind of vary things up. And for that reason, I'm actually really, really grateful that there's other people who've also been testing and trying different scenarios in different situations. For all of that testing and information and discussion, I'm going to link to that down in the video description as well. Then next, moving on to the Uniden DFR8, this detector is reasonably good on K-band, especially with TSF turned off, but once you turn it on, it does start to slow down the detector, which wasn't true with the R series. The R series seems to be just as responsive even with the filter enabled. Then as far as the Batman detector, this actually did surprisingly well, but at the same time it has zero BSM filtering, so it also falses like crazy. So the results are good and cool, I guess, good to know, but ultimately not that useful. Next, with the Radenso Pro M, this actually did best with TS Reg set to off or low. If you set it to high, that's going to start to slow down the detector. Then as far as the Radenso XP, this detector is slower overall, and also affected by TSR, which is going to slow things down even further. Additionally, the ramp up was really weird here with the Radenso XP, regardless of the power cable. It never alerted at full tilt immediately. It never really properly, accurately conveyed the urgency and the immediacy of the alert. It did ramp up to full strength, but it would not do that immediately, both on K or on KA. Next, moving on to the Rocky Mountain Radar Judge 2.0, this is when things start to get really bad, especially from behind. If you have TSR turned off, you're going to get some really heavy delays with alerting to signals from behind. But then if you go and turn TSR on, you pretty much turned off rear detection on K-band against the Falcon HR. And then when it comes to the scrambling capabilities to prevent the police radar gun from acquiring a speed, again, just like literally every single test I've ever done with the Rocky Mountain radar products, it doesn't have any effect on the radar gun. Then the Whistler CR97, this detector actually did alright with TFSR turned off, but once you turned it on, it started to slow the detector down quite a bit. Then as far as the V1 Gen 2, it's going to take about a second or so for this detector to go off, regardless of the different logic modes when you're facing strong instant on. It is recommended still to use a Valentine cable and not an Escort smart cord, like I did, both for like real world driving and saving yourself a ton of extra work and headache going back and retesting all this stuff. So yeah, just run an Escort, or no, don't run an Escort cable, run a V1 cable, and you should be good to go here with the V1. And then next, moving on to some Escort detectors. The Max 3 and the Redline 360C turned in surprisingly poor numbers. They were actually at the bottom of the pack. What's scary is if I wasn't testing with the Rocky Mountain Radar or the Cobra Road Scout, the Max 3 and the Redline 360C would have turned in the absolute worst numbers out of the entire pack. That's kind of crazy. I mean, these are expensive detectors. The Redline 360C is the most expensive windshield mount you can get. Yes, there's a lot of advantages too. There's a lot of great things about that detector. But for this test specifically, when I'm looking at response time, both K and KA, the Redline 360C and the Max 3, they're turning in pretty bad numbers. I really hope that this is something that Escort addresses in a future firmware update. Now, as far as the Max 360C, I know it doesn't have the range of the Redline 360C. It's not RDD immune. But when it comes to responsiveness, this detector actually did pretty well. It beat out the other Escort detectors. It beat out the V1 Gen 2. It was only the Uniden R3 and R7 that managed to outperform it. The DFR8, Pro M, and CR97 also managed to outperform it, but that wasn't the case once you started maxing out the filters and going for maximum BSM filtering. So the Max 360C did surprisingly well, especially with all the different filters enabled. And then finally, there's the Cobra Road Scout, which turned in 3 to 5 second delays up front, and then from the rear gave 0 detection whatsoever. No alert. So that was the heaviest delays and the worst performance with no alert whatsoever out of any setting with any mode, whether we're looking at maximum sensitivity or really aggressive filtering. And so with the Road Scout, that unfortunately came in dead last place in this particular test. And with all that said, I guess maybe just one final disclaimer. This is just one test. Maybe multiple tests wrapped into one, but this is really just one test. It's focused on strong instant-on K-band response times. There's many other things that you could test, different radar guns that you could test against. You could run maybe different settings on your detectors. You could run with different firmwares, which could change the performance of the detector. You could test with weak instant-on as opposed to strong. Like, there's so many different things that you can test. So no one test, including this one, is designed to be the end-all, be-all that covers everything you know or everything you need to know for every situation. This is just kind of one specific type of test, and hopefully it provides some useful information that you've learned. I know I've definitely learned a bunch of stuff here, and I hope you did too, and I hope you enjoyed this video. So, whew, yeah, I guess with all that said, that's it for now. If you've made it to the very end, thank you so much. I know probably not everybody will. This is going to be a longer and more involved video, but either way, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you guys are all doing well, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.